companies are really acutely aware that there's not only a legal obligation to communicate about these issues, but also a moral obligation. So in companies especially that are B2C, that are consumer facing, those reputations are all that they have to go on when it comes to maintaining their customer relationships. So they have a very vested interest in communicating, making sure that their customers know what steps they need to take and that they know what steps the companies are taking.
Yeah. So how have you found that, I mean, what's interesting, we've all know about big breaches, you know, Target, Home Depot, Anthem. Is there an acceptance within the consumer base that these are just things that happen? Or is there a real risk that consumers could really turn away from these brands?
That's a really important question. I think what we've seen over the last few years is that the pendulum is starting to move a little bit on that. Where 3 or 4 years ago, data breaches were a huge deal and huge news, and consumers really felt very personally hurt by the impact of these circumstances. But we're seeing now that the public understand that data breaches are more or less a part of modern life. You know, it's hard to name a sector or an industry that hasn't been impacted by a substantial cyber issue of some type. And I think there's a little bit of numbness to that on the public part. But again, there is a measurable impact where consumers, at least temporarily, tend to turn away from a brand. And these are still relatively new, so it's hard to say what the long-term impact is. There have been lots of studies. Certainly it's something that companies are concerned about and want to do everything they can preventatively so that they don't have to deal with that.
So are you also helping, especially small companies, figure out how they can go about securing their data in better ways?
Well, that's actually an important distinction. So we are working with lots of small companies on the front end. But we're not technical experts.
Right.
We don't pretend to be technical experts. So we do work collaboratively with the technical experts that our clients bring to the table. So working with their legal counsel, working with their IT resources and security experts, and helping them figure out how to communicate around these issues. So what that usually looks like on the back end is making sure that they're connecting the dots behind the scenes, making sure that the legal folks are talking to the communications folks and talking to the IT folks and preparing for the right risks.
One of the things we write a lot about at Passcode are the privacy issues around sharing your information with retailers, for instance, or any company for that matter. Does that factor into your conversations as well with companies? Because the privacy implications can also be a PR disaster for companies as well.
Absolutely, and that's a huge consideration, as you said, especially on the retail side, starting to become one in the healthcare side and the wearable space. It's certainly something that a lot of consumers are concerned about. I don't know that that has reached critical mass yet as far as public concern goes. Where our clients are concerned, we're talking with them about ensuring that they have kind of a guiding philosophy that is helping the organization determine behind the scenes what does and doesn't qualify as creepy. The definition is a little bit different for everyone, so ensuring that everyone within the company is kind of singing off the same song sheet.
So tell me a little bit more about the creepy discussion, right? Because some of those things, some people might think, wow, it's great that I'm getting targeted ads that the big retailers know about me because they know my shopping habits. Other people might think that is creepy. So how do you draw that distinction?
Right.
You have a creepy scale, for instance?
There is not a creepy scale because, again, as you said, that's deeply personal. A lot of that division, though, is generational. Millennials that are more and more dependent on technology and that are more and more comfortable with e-commerce, as long as you're able to describe the service that you're offering in terms of the benefits that it provides, we're seeing that millennials and younger consumers are really open to sharing more information. And again, it's a very personal decision, but it's important that companies look at those issues and make active decisions around how much data they're taking in, how they're using that data, how they're protecting that data. And I think that framework is going to become a really important rubric that consumers use when they evaluate whether or not they want to do business with a company.
So let's go back to what happens after you've been hacked, and from a public relations point of view. How long of a cycle is this? I mean, stories come and go of big breaches, and they sort of die down in the media. But for the outreach to the customer, are we talking about a year, or like working through with companies to provide identity theft protection and that sort of thing? Or does the story end for the company and you when it dies down in the press?
I think reputation recovery from one of these issues is definitely a long-term concern and a long-term project for a lot of companies. In terms of the immediate early action scale, obviously there's a lot of work behind the scenes in most cases before a big data breach is announced publicly. And part of that just goes back to having a good forensic understanding of what happened, exactly what was exposed, what action needs to be taken. We work with some companies that our work is entirely preparatory. In some cases, we help them through the media announcement, and in others, we're still working with companies that experienced issues a few years ago.
What sort of pressure is coming from the government in terms of, there's a lot of talk now about data breach notification from the government, but also, there's from federal regulators and financial regulators who want to know these things, like in quarterly reports. Is that,
right.
You see that pressure playing out at the executive level?
Companies, and particularly boards of directors and executives in the C-suite, are really trying to understand, this is a moving target, everything's shifting very quickly, particularly in the EU, trying to understand how these changing regulations are going to impact their business. A huge concern for multinationals, and frankly a big concern for companies that do business in lots of different states, because as you know right now there's a pretty big patchwork of regulations that each state has its own slightly different notification requirements. So I know some companies are very much in favor of a national standard that at least eliminates that kind of stopgap approach to reporting. So it's interesting to see where that'll land.
What is the split of your portfolio in terms of European clients and American clients, or clients that have operations everywhere, right? Because the regulations are quite different. I imagine helping them navigate that is a part of the
They
issue.
are. My experience personally has really been more with US-based companies dealing with US clients. Completely different set of legal requirements and regulations there. And as they are just starting to kind of gel around the last round of regulations that was announced, I think we're going to start seeing a lot more activity on the EU side.
Okay, so I imagine you guys might get some panicked calls late in the evening occasionally.
It happens.
What's your one piece of advice what not to do when you get one of those calls? We've just been hacked, a reporter's calling, what am I supposed to tell them?
Don't panic, and don't say too much too soon. There's the good analogy we like to use of you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. So it's important that your communications are considered, that they're strategic, and that they're really aligned with fact. But I think one really important point there is that the public is the body that decides what's fact. There's the reality of the circumstance, but because you're usually talking about a very highly technical situation, the public's understanding of that circumstance is really what shapes the reputation going forward through an issue. So the learning there is whoever's first past the post is really the entity that determines the reality of a story. So that's something that our clients are very concerned about, how that comes out in the media sphere through leaks. If a story comes out before a company really has a chance to fully consider and formulate a response, that can really put them on the defensive. And it's something we're working with a lot of our clients on, coming up with a reactive, or rather a proactive approach, so that they're not put in a reactive position.
Well, you know us in the media, we love leaks. So if you have any,
great,
you know where to go.
I do.
So any questions out here from our small but engaged group of
I have a microphone here.
cookie eaters and chip consumers?
So sometimes companies, I guess, in an effort to make their customers feel more confident with their services, they explain what kind of security systems they use, like the type of encryption, or if they use two-step authentication and any other system they have implemented. Do you think that might be bad for them also because they're exposing the inner workings of their security system to potential attackers?
That's a really good question. I think the point there is to make sure you're kind of achieving a balance and giving just enough information that can give your consumers and your stakeholders a sense that you're acting responsibly and you're taking the right steps and you're doing the right things, but you're not giving away too much. You're not sharing enough information that it would compromise the integrity of your security of your operations.
You know, and many of my questions were sort of directed at like how you talk to companies about communicating with the public, but it's also communicating with shareholders as well. I mean, public stakeholders in the company. Is that there are different strategies around how you do that?
I would say the overall strategy there is very much the same, which is making sure you're consistent in what you're communicating, making sure what you're communicating is factual, but it's still easy to understand, and then making sure you're maintaining a forward focus on what's next for the company. How do you maintain your consumer focus at the same time that you're dealing with a huge internal operational issue? And beyond just shareholders, there's also an important role for managing your other third-party stakeholders, business partners, advocates, other entities that you're involved with, and making sure that they know that you're taking these issues seriously and responding appropriately.
So also, have you noticed a growth within the PR community? Like PR is like not only representing cybersecurity companies who want to sell their products, but also like working with them specifically on managing that issue around on risk and breaches.
Absolutely. I spend the majority of my time on crisis issues, but I can tell you over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, my time spent on cyber issues has increased substantially to the point that last year I was spending about 70% of my time on cyber issues. So certainly people who do what we do and that focus on crisis communications and risk mitigation issues, cyber is a huge, huge focus right now in the industry.
Is there one particular, hold on. All right, before she forgets her question, then I have one more for you.
So you say you are representing a lot of clients who are now cybersecurity is coming up a lot in your crisis management. Are you finding that these corporate companies are more or willingly forthcoming with, yes, we got hacked? Because sometimes companies don't want to admit that they got hacked, and so they hide it, but then it leaks out and then it becomes troublesome, especially for the PR company representing them. What's the trend nowadays? What do you tell companies to do when they do get hacked? Is it better to come forward with it that yes, we admit that and this is what we're doing to further secure our databases?
I think there are a couple ways to skin that cat. I think that it goes back to the fact that, especially if you're talking about a data breach of personally identifiable information, you're not only dealing with really specific legal requirements to communicate that, you also have a moral obligation that your customers deserve to know that their information has been compromised. So I don't know that we've encountered companies that have considered hiding that information. I think there have been times when they might have experienced a cyber issue that there aren't communication requirements around, and in those instances you do have a tough decision to make. Is it beneficial to the trustworthiness of your brand in the long run to share that information proactively? And again, that goes back to what we're trying to help our companies do proactively, which is figure out now what you would do in the instance of an event so that you've already made that decision and you don't have to make it in kind of the heat of battle.
Good question.
I have a question. I understand the rationale for waiting a little bit to get your communications all squared up and to know the facts, etc. But isn't time really of the essence after a hack? I mean, if people's sort of personal information is suddenly out there, credit card information, wouldn't they want to know as fast as possible if there might be an issue so that they can shut that down and put freezes in place? Is it really great advice to have them delay that information?
That's a good question. So I think that bears a little bit of parsing. When we talk about waiting to communicate that information, we're not advocating that a company wait for some sort of artificial amount of time to share the information on what happened. It's more about just making sure that you have an accurate understanding of what happened. Lots of companies now are actually looking at making another tough decision, which is, do we want to publicly announce that we've been hacked and then go back in a few weeks and say, okay, we have more information now. This is exactly whose information may have been exposed. This is how many people may have been affected. This is kind of what was at risk. And that is something that a lot of companies have done to good effect. And I think it's something that consumers certainly appreciate as a kind of sign of trustworthiness.
And I think that's why, I mean, a lot of companies wait a very long time. And sometimes that's why you see the data, the breach notification laws being proposed now. And I think California probably has the most aggressive when it comes to that.
You know, I think the other piece to that puzzle, though, is the fact that there's risk in communicating too much at first. And that risk is in the fact that that information can be wrong. And there have been a couple of really high-profile breaches where companies have had to go back and make corrective statements, you know, saying that different information was exposed or a much larger number of records were exposed, and there is a reputational fallout to that. So the question is, it's a hard one. I think when companies are making a decision as to what to do there, you're between a rock and a hard place, and trying to weigh those risks and make difficult decisions are becoming kind of part of the norm for companies that are trying to figure out how to navigate that world.
Great. So one last question. So since you are spending so much time in this space, and it sort of puts you at a bit of an advantage to see, well, what are the biggest problems now that companies are facing? Is there one particular issue that you see coming up time and time again in terms of are companies dealing with like ransomware attacks or some other sorts of things? Are you noticing any trends there?
I think that breaches of PII still kind of remain the top #1 concern for most of the companies that we're working with. And that is true whether they're retailers that may be dealing with PIN numbers or companies in the healthcare space that have slightly more sensitive information in their databases. I think two of the big emerging areas that we're hearing a lot more from companies now are ransomware and other types of socially engineered attacks. That's something that we know anecdotally from lots of forensics firms that they're putting lots of energy and effort into their penetration testing for socially engineered attacks. And I think it's something we're going to hear a lot more about.
All right. Well, thanks so much for stopping by the booth.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks.